Frank Carter stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his small Montana home. His weathered face told the story of his 72 years, with deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. He combed his thinning gray hair and straightened the collar of his plaid shirt. Tonight was the monthly gathering at O'Malley's bar where he met with other veterans from the area. He opened his wallet and counted the bills inside. Not much, but enough for a few beers. Behind his driver's license sat an old faded card he never removed, his military ID from his days in Vietnam. The photo showed a young man with sharp eyes and a serious expression. Frank barely recognized himself in that image anymore, but he kept it anyway. Some habits were hard to break. The drive to O'Malley's took 15 minutes along roads Frank knew by heart. The bar sat on the edge of town, a low wooden building with neon beer signs glowing in the windows. Frank parked his old pickup truck between newer vehicles and made his way inside. "Frank, about time you showed up," called Joe Nelson from a corner table. Joe had served in the same unit as Frank, though they hadn't known each other well until they discovered they lived in the same town 20 years ago. Frank nodded and walked to the table where Joe sat with two other men, Pete Simmons, another Vietnam vet, and Doug Wilson, who had served in the First Gulf War. "Sorry I'm late. Had to fix a leak under the sink," Frank said, sliding into an empty chair. "Plumbing problems again?" "Should get someone to look at that whole system," Pete suggested. Frank shrugged. "Can't afford it, fixed it myself well enough." A young bartender with a neat beard and tattooed arms approached their table. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" They ordered their usual drinks, and Frank listened as the others talked about their families, the changing town, and politics, a topic Frank tried to avoid. When their second round came, Frank reached for his wallet. "My turn to buy," he insisted. The others protested weakly but let him pay. Frank opened his wallet and accidentally pulled out his military ID instead of his credit card. He stared at it for a moment before fishing out the right card. The bartender noticed the old ID. "Whoa, is that your military ID? That thing looks ancient." Frank nodded and handed over his credit card. "From 1969. The bartender picked up the ID, examining it with amusement. "Man, this belongs in a museum. They don't make them like this anymore." He chuckled and showed it to a younger customer sitting at the bar. "Check this out. Prehistoric military tech," the bartender joked. The younger man laughed. "What's it made of? Dinosaur skin?" Several other patrons glanced over, some smiling or laughing at the worn, outdated card. Frank felt his face grow warm. He wasn't angry. He understood that to them, Vietnam was ancient history, something from textbooks. But the disrespect stung all the same. "Card's a bit old but still worked fine when it mattered," Frank said quietly, taking back his ID and placing it carefully in his wallet. Joe shot an annoyed look at the bartender, who had the good sense to look slightly embarrassed. "Sorry, man. No disrespect meant," the bartender said, handing back Frank's credit card after running it through the machine. Frank waved off the apology. No harm done. The night continued, and the incident was forgotten as they shared stories and memories. By 11 o'clock, Frank felt tired. He said goodbye to his friends and drove home through the quiet streets of the small town. His house was dark and silent when he returned. Frank had lived alone since his wife died 5 years ago. Their daughter lived in California with her husband and two kids, visiting only once or twice a year. Frank got ready for bed, placing his wallet on the nightstand as he always did. He fell asleep quickly, his body tired from the day. The harsh ring of his phone jarred him awake. Frank fumbled for the lamp and squinted at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Who would call at this hour? His first thought was his daughter. Had something happened to her or the grandkids? "Hello?" he answered, his voice rough with sleep. "Mr. Frank Carter?" The voice was female, crisp and professional. "Yes, who's this?" "Colonel Patricia Morgan, Pentagon Special Operations Division. I apologize for the late hour, but this matter couldn't wait." Frank sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "The Pentagon? What's this about?" "Mr. Carter, this concerns your military service and specifically your military identification card from 1969. Frank glanced at his wallet on the nightstand. "My ID? That thing's over 50 years old. Yes, sir. That's precisely why I'm calling. We need to meet with you as soon as possible. A car will arrive at your residence tomorrow at 800 hours to transport you to the airport. From there, you'll be flown to Washington, D.C. Frank's mind raced. This had to be some kind of mistake or scam. Look, I don't know who you really are, but your service number is 5863294A. You served with the 25th Infantry Division from 1968 to 1971. You received a Purple Heart after being wounded near Cam Ranh Bay in March 1969. You were treated by a field medic named Kevin Barlow. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. No scammer would know those details. How do you know all that? Mr. Carter, there are aspects of your military ID card that are highly classified. I can't discuss them over an unsecured line. Will you cooperate with us? Frank ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of this bizarre turn of events. His old military ID? The same one that had been laughed at just hours ago? What if I refuse? Colonel Morgan's voice remained calm but took on a steely edge. This is a matter of national security, Mr. Carter. Your cooperation is not optional, but I assure you, you will be treated with the utmost respect and compensated for your time. Frank looked around his small, empty house. What did he have to lose? I'll be ready at 8. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Pack for 3 days, and bring your military ID card. The line went dead. Frank sat in the dark, staring at his wallet. The same ID card that young people had laughed at tonight was somehow important enough for the Pentagon to call him in the middle of the night. What could possibly be special about his old military ID? Frank didn't sleep again that night. He packed a small bag and sat in his living room watching the darkness fade into dawn, wondering what secrets his past held that even he didn't know about. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, a black SUV with government plates pulled up in front of Frank's house. 2 men in dark suits stepped out. They knocked on his door with precise, measured taps. Frank opened the door, his small suitcase, already packed and waiting by his feet. He had changed his shirt 3 times that morning, unsure what to wear for a mysterious Pentagon meeting. He had settled on a simple button-up shirt and his best pair of jeans. "Mr. Carter?" asked the taller agent. "That's me," Frank said. "I'm Agent Lewis. This is Agent Patel. We're here to escort you to the airport." Frank nodded and picked up his suitcase. "Let's go then." The drive to the small regional airport was quiet. Frank tried asking questions, but the agents politely told him they weren't authorized to discuss the reason for his trip. At the airport, they bypassed the regular terminal and drove directly onto the tarmac where a sleek government jet waited. "Never been on one of these before," Frank commented as he climbed the stairs. Inside, the jet was fitted with comfortable leather seats. Frank had expected to find other passengers, perhaps the other veterans Colonel Morgan had mentioned, but he was alone except for the agents and flight crew. "Flight time to D.C. will be about 3 hours, sir," the pilot informed him. "Please make yourself comfortable." Frank tried to relax during the flight, but his mind kept racing with questions. What was so important about his old military ID? Why now, after more than 50 years? When they landed at a military airfield outside Washington, another black SUV was waiting. Frank was driven through the city to the Pentagon. The massive building looked just like it did on TV, only more impressive in person. Inside, Frank was led through security checkpoints where guards examined his ID carefully before allowing him to pass. They took an elevator down instead of up, descending far below ground level. "Didn't know the Pentagon went down this far," Frank remarked. Agent Lewis smiled slightly. "Most people don't." They exited into a corridor with stark white walls. Frank was brought to a room with a long table where several people sat waiting. A tall woman in an Air Force uniform stood as he entered. "Mr. Carter, thank you for coming. I'm Colonel Patricia Morgan. We spoke on the phone." Frank shook her hand. "Not like I had much choice." Colonel Morgan gestured to a chair. "Please have a seat. Would you like coffee or water?" "Coffee, black," Frank said, sitting down. A young lieutenant quickly brought him a steaming cup. Frank looked around the table. Besides Colonel Morgan, there were 4 men and 1 woman in military uniforms, plus 2 civilians in expensive-looking suits who had the serious expressions of important government officials. "Mr. Carter, Do you have your military ID with you? Colonel Morgan asked. Frank reached for his wallet and pulled out the worn card. He placed it on the table. One of the civilians, a balding man with glasses, leaned forward eagerly. May I? Frank nodded, and the man picked up the ID card, handling it with surprising care, as if it were made of thin glass that might shatter. Remarkable, the man whispered. After all these years, the embedded technology is still intact. Technology? Frank asked. It's just a laminated card with my picture and information. Colonel Morgan exchanged glances with the others before speaking. Mr. Carter, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level. You'll need to sign some non-disclosure agreements before we proceed. The lieutenant placed a stack of papers in front of Frank. He skimmed them, understanding little of the legal language but getting the point. Talk about this and go to prison for a very long time. This all seems a bit much for an old ID card, Frank said, but signed where indicated. Colonel Morgan nodded to one of the technicians. The lights dimmed, and a projection appeared on the wall. It showed what looked like Frank's ID card, but magnified many times. Strange patterns were visible in the laminate, patterns that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Mr. Carter, in 1969, your generation of military IDs contained something we called Project Sentinel. It was experimental technology, far beyond anything the public knew existed at that time. Frank stared at the projection. What kind of technology? The balding civilian spoke up. Quantum encrypted biomarkers, Mr. Carter. Your ID card is linked to your specific DNA. It contains information, a code that was imprinted at the molecular level. Frank shook his head. That sounds like science fiction. We didn't have that kind of technology back then. We didn't, Colonel Morgan said, quietly. That's the point. Frank looked at her, confused. I don't understand. Colonel Morgan took a deep breath. 3 weeks ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected signals approaching Earth. These signals match exactly with the encryption pattern found in your generation of military IDs. The program wasn't just ahead of its time, Mr. Carter. We now believe it wasn't our technology at all. The room fell silent as Frank processed this information. Are you saying aliens? Frank finally asked, feeling ridiculous even saying the word. We prefer non-terrestrial intelligence, one of the military officers said. But yes, essentially. Frank laughed nervously. You're telling me my military ID was made by aliens? Not made by them, the balding scientist corrected. But the encryption method embedded in it appears to have been derived from technology not of this Earth. The program was shut down in 1970 when the scientists couldn't explain how it worked. Records were sealed and eventually, everyone forgot about it. Colonel Morgan leaned forward. Everyone except whoever or whatever put it there in the first place. They're coming back, Mr. Carter. And we think they're coming back for the people who carry these IDs. Frank took a long sip of his coffee, wishing it was something stronger. How many others are there, with these special IDs? Your ID series was limited. Only 212 were ever issued, all to personnel in specific units. Of those, only 7 individuals are still living. You're the first one we've contacted. Frank thought about the bartender and customers laughing at his old ID just the night before. If they only knew, what do you need me to do? He asked. Colonel Morgan looked relieved at his question. First, we need to run some tests on you and your ID card together. There appears to be a biological component that activates when the card is in proximity to its owner. And then we bring in the others, all 7 of you together. Frank stared at his old ID card on the table, seeing it with new eyes. Not just a relic of his past, but perhaps the key to humanity's future. When do we start? He asked. The next morning, Frank sat in a large conference room sipping coffee and waiting. Scientists had spent hours the previous day scanning his ID card and taking blood samples from him. They asked him countless questions about his service, his health, and whether he had experienced any strange dreams or unusual physical symptoms over the years. Frank had been put up in a comfortable room within the Pentagon complex for the night, but he had barely slept. The door opened, and Colonel Morgan entered, followed by 6 elderly people, 3 men and 3 women. Frank stood up, suddenly nervous. "Mr. Carter, allow me to introduce the others," Colonel Morgan said. A tall, thin woman with short silver hair stepped forward first. Elaine Powell, former major, Army Intelligence Corps. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and assessing. Next was a black man in a wheelchair. George Williams, Corporal, Marines. He nodded at Frank with a friendly smile. A stocky man with a thick mustache and suspicious eyes introduced himself next. Hector Ramirez, Sergeant, Army Rangers, still trying to figure out if this is some kind of government scam. A slender woman with intelligent eyes adjusted her glasses. Diane Miller, Lieutenant, Naval Operations. Good to meet you, Frank. An older man with kind eyes and a medical alert bracelet stepped forward. Alan Jackson, Army medic. Been having weird dreams lately. Guess now I know why. The last was a tall man with hearing aids. William Boyd, communications specialist. I recognized those signals the moment they showed them to me. Been hearing similar patterns in my head for months. Frank shook hands with each of them, noting how different they all were, yet connected by this strange twist of fate. Colonel Morgan gestured for everyone to sit. Now that you're all here, we can proceed with a full briefing. A screen lowered from the ceiling and the lights dimmed. Images of star charts and signal patterns appeared. 3 weeks ago, deep space monitoring stations detected these signals. Approaching Earth, Colonel Morgan explained. They're coming from what appears to be a fleet of vessels. Hector crossed his arms. So definitely aliens? That's our working theory, replied Colonel Morgan. We've attempted communication but received no response. How fast are they moving? Asked Diane, who seemed to be analyzing everything carefully. They'll reach Earth orbit in approximately 5 days, said Colonel Morgan. A scientist entered, carrying a tray with 7 military IDs, their IDs. Each had been placed in a clear protective case. We've made some discoveries, the scientist said, distributing the IDs to their owners. When we examined each ID individually, we found encrypted data fragments. But when we placed all 7 in proximity, he arranged 7 replica IDs on the table in a circle. The overhead projector showed a magnified view. Strange markings became visible on the surfaces, glowing faintly. Together, they form a complete star map, the scientist continued, and what appears to be an activation code. Frank examined his ID in its case. To his surprise, symbols now appeared on its surface that hadn't been there before. These markings weren't visible yesterday, Frank said. They're responding to proximity. The closer all 7 IDs get to each other, the more information they reveal, explained the scientist. William leaned forward in his chair. These symbols, they match patterns in the signals. Alan rubbed his temples. I've seen these in my dreams, structures rising from the earth. The group fell silent, contemplating the implications. What exactly do you need us to do? Elaine asked directly. Colonel Morgan straightened. We believe your IDs are keys to something left on Earth long ago, possibly defense systems or communication devices. We need to understand how to activate them before the visitors arrive. And you need all 7 of us because, George asked from his wheelchair, the biomarkers in your blood interact with your IDs. Each of you has a unique code. Together, they complete the sequence, replied the scientist. A young lieutenant entered the room and whispered something to Colonel Morgan. Her expression darkened. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a development. The vessels have suddenly accelerated. New arrival estimate is 36 hours. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. We need to move faster than planned. Colonel Morgan continued. You'll begin training immediately. Training for what? Asked Frank. To understand your role in whatever's coming. They were led to another section of the underground facility. Young military personnel moved quickly through the corridors, some casting curious or skeptical glances at the 7 elderly veterans. In a large room filled with high-tech equipment, they met their training team, experts in various fields who would help them prepare. With all due respect, said a young captain with a dubious expression, we're putting Earth's defense in the hands of 7 senior citizens? Elaine stepped forward, her former military bearing evident. Son, we may be old, but we've survived, longer than most in your position would have." Frank noticed how the young officers looked at them, with a mixture of doubt and barely concealed amusement. It reminded him of the bartender laughing at his old ID. They spent hours reviewing what little information was available about the approaching vessels and learning to use equipment that might help them interface with whatever their IDs were meant to activate. During a short break, Frank found himself standing next to George, who maneuvered his wheelchair with practiced ease. "Never thought I'd be back in service at my age," George commented. Frank nodded. "Especially not for something like this." "Those young officers think we're jokes," George said quietly. "Let them think what they want," Frank replied. "We'll show them what we can do when it matters." As day turned to evening, they gathered again in the conference room. The screen now showed 7 locations around the globe, each marked with a pulsing red dot. "These are the sites where we believe the ancient technology is hidden," Colonel Morgan explained. "They align perfectly with the star map formed by your IDs." "You want us to split up," Diane stated matter-of-factly. Colonel Morgan nodded. "Each of you will be transported to one location, accompanied by a military team. You'll need to use your IDs to activate whatever is waiting there." Frank studied the map. His assigned location appeared to be somewhere in the American Southwest. "What happens when we activate these sites?" Alan asked. "Honestly, we don't know," Colonel Morgan admitted. "But given the approaching threat, we believe they're our best hope." As they prepared to retire for the night, an alarm suddenly blared throughout the facility. Colonel Morgan received an urgent communication through her earpiece. "They've entered our solar system," she announced grimly. "All personnel to battle stations. We deploy at first light." Frank exchanged looks with the other 6 veterans. Despite their age and the skepticism of those around them, they were now Earth's first line of defense. The ID card that had been laughed at days ago might be the key to humanity's survival. Dawn broke over Washington, D.C. as Frank was led to a helicopter, waiting on the Pentagon's landing pad. He carried a small pack containing personal items and his military ID, now housed in a special protective case that hung around his neck. The scientists had warned him not to remove it under any circumstances. "Your destination is a remote section of the Grand Canyon," Colonel Morgan told him as they walked. "Satellite imagery identified unusual energy readings there that match the signature in your ID." Frank nodded, too nervous to speak. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about what would happen when he reached his destination. "Captain, Ryan and his team will accompany you," Colonel Morgan continued, gesturing to a serious-looking officer waiting by the helicopter. "They'll provide security and technical support." Frank shook the colonel's hand. "What about the others?" "All ready, on their way to their assigned locations. Elaine to Stonehenge, George to the Nazca lines in Peru, Hector to a site in Egypt, Diane to an island in the South Pacific, Alan to a location in Tibet, and William to a spot in the Australian outback." Frank glanced at the young Captain Ryan, who was checking his weapon and giving instructions to his team. The captain's expression revealed his doubt about this mission, and particularly about Frank's role in it. "They still don't believe in us," Frank commented quietly. Colonel Morgan's expression softened slightly. "Prove them wrong, Mr. Carter." The helicopter ride was followed by a transfer to a military plane, and finally another helicopter that carried Frank and Captain Ryan's team deep into the Grand Canyon. Frank stared out the window at the magnificent red rock formations below. Somewhere down there was ancient technology that only he could activate. Global communications had been disrupted as the alien vessels entered Earth's atmosphere. News of the strange ships had leaked to the public, causing panic in major cities. The president had addressed the nation, calling for calm while acknowledging the unidentified craft in Earth's skies. The helicopter landed on a small plateau, and Frank stepped out, feeling the hot desert air hit his face. Captain Ryan and his team of 6 soldiers quickly secured the area. "The energy signature is coming from approximately half a mile that way," said a technician, pointing toward a narrow path that led down into a side canyon. "Let's move," ordered Captain Ryan. "Mr. Carter, stay in the middle of the formation. We don't know what's out here." They hiked down the rocky path, Frank moving carefully on the uneven terrain. Despite his age, he kept pace, determined not to slow them down. "Control, this is Eagle Team," Captain Ryan spoke into his radio. "We've reached the Grand Canyon site and are approaching the target coordinates." Static was the only response. "Comms are still down," reported a communications specialist. "The interference is getting worse." Captain Ryan frowned. "Must be the alien vessels. Keep trying." As they descended deeper into the canyon, Frank felt a strange warmth emanating from the ID case against his chest. When he touched it, the case was hot. "Something's happening," Frank said, pulling out the ID. The symbols on it were glowing brighter, pulsating with an inner light. "It's reacting to the sight," the technician said, checking readings on his equipment. "We must be getting close." They rounded a bend in the narrow path and found themselves facing a smooth wall of red rock that looked oddly out of place among the naturally eroded formations. "This isn't natural," Captain Ryan said, approaching the wall cautiously. "It's too uniform." The technician scanned the wall. "There's an energy field running through it, similar to the signature in Mr. Carter's ID." Frank stepped forward, drawn to the wall by an instinct he couldn't explain. The ID around his neck pulsed faster. "I think I need to place the ID against the wall," Frank said. Captain Ryan looked skeptical but nodded. "Do it, but carefully." Frank removed the ID from its case and approached the wall. As he got closer, the symbols on the ID glowed even brighter. He pressed the card against the smooth, red surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then lines of light spread from the point of contact, tracing patterns across the rock face. The entire wall began to hum with energy. "Step back," Captain Ryan ordered, pulling Frank away as the wall started to split down the middle. The rock face slid apart, revealing a dark passageway that led deeper into the earth. Cool air rushed out from the opening. "This is impossible," muttered one of the soldiers. "This canyon's been mapped extensively. There shouldn't be anything like this here." "Stay alert," Captain Ryan said, switching on his tactical light. "We're going in." They entered the passageway, weapons ready. Frank's ID continued to glow, providing additional light. The passage led them down a sloping tunnel that appeared to be carved from solid rock. After walking for several minutes, they emerged into a vast chamber. Their lights couldn't reach the ceiling or far walls. In the center stood a structure unlike anything Frank had ever seen, a towering pillar covered in the same symbols that were on his ID. "What is that?" Captain Ryan whispered, his skepticism replaced by awe. Before anyone could answer, the ground shook violently. Dust and small rocks rained down from above. "Earthquake?" asked one of the soldiers. The technician checked his equipment. "No, something's happening in the atmosphere. Massive energy readings." Captain Ryan tried his radio again. "Control, do you copy? We need a status update." This time, a broken response came through. "Eagle Team, alien vessels, attacking major cities. Other sites activated. Need yours online now." Frank moved toward the central pillar, drawn by the increasing warmth of his ID. "I need to place my ID on that structure." "Wait for orders," Captain Ryan insisted. Another violent tremor shook the chamber, more severe than the first. A large section of the ceiling collapsed, crushing 2 soldiers beneath the rubble. "Peterson, Garcia." Captain Ryan rushed to the fallen men, but it was clear they hadn't survived. Through the new hole in the ceiling, Frank could see the sky had turned an unnatural red. A dark shape moved across it, massive and ominous. The radio crackled again. "Eagle Team, Washington under attack. Activation sequence. Required immediately." "Do it now," Captain Ryan shouted to Frank. Frank hurried to the central pillar. Up close, he could see a rectangular indentation that matched the size of his ID perfectly. He placed the card into the slot. The pillar erupted with blinding light. Symbols across its surface flared to life, and the ground began to shake continuously. "What's happening?" Frank yelled over the rumbling. "The entire area is shifting," the technician shouted back, staring at his readings in disbelief. The chamber walls started to reconfigure, sections of rock sliding away to reveal complex machinery that had been hidden for who knew how long. The ceiling opened completely, giving them a clear view of the red sky and the massive alien vessel hovering above. A beam of energy shot upward from the central pillar, striking the underside of the alien craft. The vessel shuddered visibly. In Frank's mind, images suddenly appeared. The other 6 veterans at their sites, each experiencing something similar. Somehow, he could see them, feel their presence. They were connected through their IDs, through the ancient technology they had activated. The beam from Frank's site joined with 6 others from around the globe, forming a network that encircled the Earth like a protective web. Captain Ryan grabbed Frank's arm, his earlier doubt completely gone. "You did it, you actually did it." Frank watched as the alien vessel above them struggled against the energy beam. More ships became visible in the distance, caught in similar beams from the other sites. The battle for Earth had begun, and 7 elderly veterans with laughably outdated military IDs were leading the charge. Frank stood in the ancient chamber, his body trembling not from fear but from the energy flowing through him. The mental connection with the other 6 veterans grew stronger by the second. He could feel Elaine's determined focus at Stonehenge, George's calm resolve in Peru, Hector's fierce concentration in Egypt, Diane's analytical precision in the South Pacific, Alan's steady compassion in Tibet, and William's clear communication in Australia. They were no longer 7 separate individuals, but parts of a single system, their minds linked through the ancient technology, their military IDs serving as the keys to Earth's hidden defense network. "What's happening to you?" Captain Ryan asked, noticing Frank's distant expression. "I can see them," Frank said quietly. "The others. We're connected somehow." The chamber continued to transform around them. Sections of wall slid away, revealing screens that displayed images from around the world. They could see the alien vessels, positioned above major cities preparing to attack, but wherever the defense beams touched the ships, their weapon systems failed. "They're harvesters," Frank said suddenly, knowledge flowing into his mind through the connection. "They seeded Earth with compatible DNA ages ago. The veterans with these special IDs were descended from those they marked. They've returned to harvest what they planted." "They're here for you?" Captain Ryan asked in shock. Frank nodded. "For all of us with the special IDs, we're the result of their experiment, but someone else intervened. A guardian species left this defense system to protect us when the harvesters returned." Outside, the alien vessel fired a weapon at the energy beam, trying to break the connection. The entire chamber shook violently. Through the mental link, Frank felt a sharp pain. "William's been hurt," he gasped. "His site is under attack." Frank concentrated, focusing his thoughts toward William. The other veterans did the same, lending their strength. Together, they reinforced the Australian site's defenses. "The harvesters didn't expect resistance," Frank continued, more knowledge filling his mind. "They think of us as crops, not equals." Captain Ryan's radio crackled with a broken transmission. "All teams, defense network at 60%, need full activation. President has authorized." Operation Veteran Key. The technician checked his equipment. "The other sites are all online, but we need more power to complete the defense grid." Frank understood what needed to be done. He could feel it through the connection with the others. "My ID needs to be fully inserted into the pillar. Right now it's only making partial contact." "But the scientists said removing your ID from your possession could be dangerous for you," Captain Ryan objected. Another violent tremor shook the chamber as the alien vessel intensified its attack. More debris fell from above, narrowly missing them. "If we don't complete the activation, everyone on Earth will die," Frank said simply. He stepped forward and pushed his ID card deeper into the slot on the pillar. Pain shot through his body as the biomarker in his blood responded to the separation. But he kept pushing until the card disappeared completely into the mechanism. The pillar's light changed from blue to golden. The energy beam doubled in intensity, and Frank fell to his knees as the connection with the other veterans became overwhelming. He could see through their eyes now, experience what they were experiencing. Elaine forcing her ID into Stonehenge's central stone, George wheeling himself to the activation point in Peru despite his injuries, Hector standing firm in Egypt as alien forces attempted to breach his location, Diane calmly completing the sequence. In the South Pacific, as water flooded the chamber, Alan meditating in Tibet to strengthen the network, and William, badly wounded but still conscious, guarding his site in Australia. "It's working," the technician shouted, watching his instruments. "The defense grid is powering up to full capacity." On the screens around them, they could see the alien vessels trapped in a web of energy. Smaller craft that tried to break through the network were instantly disabled. A new knowledge flowed into Frank's mind: how to communicate with the harvesters. Through the mental link, he and the other 6 veterans sent a unified message. Earth was protected. Humans were not crops to be harvested, but an independent species under the guardianship of ancient allies. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then one by one, the harvester ships began to retreat, pulling back from Earth's atmosphere. Frank collapsed as the mental connection temporarily overwhelmed him. Captain Ryan caught him before he hit the ground. "They're leaving," Frank whispered. "They understand now. We're not defenseless. We're not alone." The next few days passed in a blur. Frank was transported back to Washington, where doctors checked him for physical effects from his connection to the ancient technology. To everyone's surprise, instead of being harmed, Frank and the other veterans showed signs of improved health. "The Guardian species built in a reward system," explained a scientist. "The defending bloodlines receive healing and extended lifespan as compensation for their service." 1 week after the activation, Frank and the other 6 veterans were honored at a global ceremony broadcast to billions of people worldwide. They sat on a stage before the United Nations General Assembly, their once mocked military IDs now displayed in beautiful crystal cases as humanity's most precious artifacts. The President of the United States approached the podium. "These 7 individuals, once ordinary soldiers, saved our world. Their outdated military IDs, objects of ridicule just days ago, turned out to be the keys to our survival." Frank looked out at the crowd. Among the dignitaries and officials, he spotted the young bartender who had laughed at his ID. The man caught Frank's eye and gave an embarrassed nod of deep respect. After the ceremony, as Frank was preparing to leave, a young recruit approached him nervously. "Sir," the young woman said, holding out her new military ID. "I know this is unusual, but would you sign this for me?" Frank noticed that her ID had been redesigned to resemble his generation's format. "They've changed all military IDs to honor your design," she explained. "Every service member will carry a reminder of what you and the others did." Frank smiled and signed his name on the back of her card. As he did, he felt a gentle pulse of energy. The Guardian species were still watching, and a new generation of defenders was already being prepared for whatever might come next. The ID that had once made him the subject of laughter now made him a legend. And somewhere in the stars, both allies and enemies knew that Earth was not to be trifled with.